Right, we're here today to talk about Brexit and its impact on the regions and nations of the UK. So I'm joined by John Patrick Clayton, who works for Unison in Northern Ireland, Aodhan Connolly, who is the director of the Northern Ireland Retail Consortium. Good morning, Aodhan. Paul Sweeney, who is former Labour Member of Parliament in Glasgow and hopefully future Labour Member of Parliament in Glasgow, and Karin Smith, who is a Labour Member of Parliament in Bristol. And we will soon be joined by Stephen Farry, who is an Alliance Member of Parliament in Belfast. So we're going to talk, obviously, this morning primarily about Northern Ireland and Scotland, but we will also touch on Wales and on the regions of England as well, which are often completely ignored in this process because they don't have that same level of representation. But nevertheless, there are, of course, tensions between different parts of England, just as they are between, London and England and the nations of the UK as well. And obviously, most of these tensions have been pre-existing for a long time, but of course have been incredibly inflamed and brought into public focus and political focus by the outfall of Brexit. So without further ado, I will come across to Karin Smith to start us off. And just for the sake of clarity for attendees, we'll have speeches from each of our panelists to start off with, and then a couple of questions from me, and then we'll come across to you with questions. So if you do have questions for just generally or for specific speakers, please put those in the Q&A box as we go, and I will pick those up when we come to questions, and we'll finish up at 10:45, so you can go on to your next meeting. Right, Karin, go ahead, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you for putting it on. And it's nice to see some colleagues. I'd like to say, particularly Paul, nice to see you. Miss you in Parliament, obviously, and hope you're well. Look, we're all doing this morning, perhaps a bit brighter-eyed and bushy-tailed than we might have been if we'd have been at conference last night. So hopefully look forward to a good discussion. I have many hats actually at the moment. I'm an English MP here in Bristol. I'm currently, and have been for some time, on our Northern Ireland team on the front bench in Parliament. I'm a member of the House of Commons Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, and I'm also Vice Chair of something called the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly. And I've taken on those roles. I think my own political journey, I am the child of Irish immigrants. I still have immediate family living in both Northern Ireland and in Ireland, and I travel across these islands a lot, and I am passionate about the way that we have been able to come together, live together peacefully, our shared history changing over particularly the last 22 years, underpinned by the settlement within the European Union. When I came an MP in 2015, I did not expect to be quite so immersed in constitutional and historical issues that I have found myself being. But that said, I do feel that we are at an important historical point, and as a political nerd all my life, it's a great privilege to be able to be in a position to influence those in the Labour Party, because I think what I've witnessed over the last 3 or 4 years is a deep level of ignorance about the way that we live across these islands. We are all used to moving, working, travelling, expecting rights that have been hard fought for and won. And we also have been able to put aside our differences, perhaps, those tensions you referred to at the beginning, within a wider political and economic framework. And that has been an amazing thing. But I do also think, and when you travel across the world, we still do have something very precious. So I'm not a doom person. I think this is a moment in time that we have to, and we have to do this very much in the Labour Party, we have to grab this opportunity about what we want to see the future constitutional settlement being. Now, I'm actually not fixed in my own view about what that looks like. People throw around terms, whether you want to call it confederations, devomax, whatever you want to call things. But I'm a huge respecter of the way that devolution has worked. I'm also mindful where it hasn't worked. In my role as on BIPA, I've been able to visit Jersey, Guernsey. We have hundreds and hundreds of years of difficult history, but also where a form of democracy has been able to thrive, and this is a great country to be living in and bringing up our children in. So I think the bill does highlight some of that tension, the bill that we are facing today, and I will have to leave this a bit early because I've got to get up to London for that bill. I think this government has no respect for devolution. I think it has no respect for the way in which people in different parts of the United Kingdom want to forge ahead, and they would do well to stop and listen. They've also got reviews coming upstream, but they're putting this bill in front of it, and they've obviously got themselves into a terrible mess over the protocol, and frankly not reading it properly, or actually reading it and pretending they haven't read it, whichever view you take. I'm sure there'll be some questions on that. So I think in the Labour Party we have had in our manifesto for the last, how many elections have we had since 2015? But going into 2015 and subsequently, that we would have a constitutional convention, and that really hasn't hit the headlines. People don't get excited about the Constitution in the way that some of us do. I find that quite astonishing, but this is how we exercise our rights and our way of being. I'm very keen to forge more discussion within the Labour Party about the Constitution, not just in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, but for me as an English MP, it's really not working in England. So this is not simple. This will take us a long time, but we need to get all our brains into it. And I do think it's fundamentally linked to how we win power in the future, because we clearly are not embedded enough in our communities across the United Kingdom in order to be able to win a majority. So I do think the two things are very much linked.
Great. Thank you, Karin. That was fascinating. If anyone has a question specifically for Karin, please do pop that in the chat, because she has to leave at 10:30. So if you have questions specifically for her, based on what she said or based on her role as Shadow Minister for Northern Ireland, then please pop those in the chat and I'll make sure that those get put to her before she has to go. But anyway, thank you again, Karin, that was great. So John Patrick, can we come to you, please? So John Patrick works for Unison in Northern Ireland, so obviously has that trade union perspective on what's going on there, and can tell us what it's like and the things that we should be worried about and do something about. Go ahead, Patrick.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for the invitation to take part this morning. I suppose just very briefly, obviously, I'm sure attendees will be well aware of Unison across the UK's largest trade union. In Northern Ireland, we've around 45,000 members. But I think when we look at ourselves in Northern Ireland, it's important to highlight how diverse we are in Northern Ireland. So we're a union which is 84% women in Northern Ireland. We represent largely the lowest paid across public services, particularly in the health service and in education. We're a union which has thousands of Black and minority ethnic members in Northern Ireland. We're probably the single largest grouping, in a sense, of Black and minority ethnic people across civic society in Northern Ireland. And we also, and going back to the issue around the constitutional future, we also are very diverse in terms of having many members who would consider themselves nationalists and identify themselves as nationalists, many members who would identify themselves as unionists, and many members who would identify themselves as none of the above. And I suppose actually whenever I was thinking about this morning's event, I know yesterday there was a brief period where there was a little bit of a Twitter storm about, I think at one point this was titled "How to Save the Union." And I think that in itself, when we look at Northern Ireland, is a little bit misplaced from our perspective as an idea, because we as a union have always been very, very strongly supportive of the Good Friday Agreement. And we've sought with others across civic society, and particularly through the Brexit process, to see it both protected and fully implemented. And of course, a key part of the agreement is consent. So when we look at the constitutional future across these islands, and particularly when we look at the constitutional future in Northern Ireland, that issue in some senses has already been settled on the basis of the principle of consent, that it'll be for the people of Northern Ireland to determine their own future for very, very good historic reasons, of which we should all be very aware. I think there's no doubt that Brexit has certainly put that debate much more front and center once again, because it has undermined some of the certainties that did exist. There can be very few certainties sometimes, I suppose, in Northern Ireland and in politics in Northern Ireland. And from a Unison perspective, I think what has concerned us from the start, and one of the reasons why both Unison and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions across the whole island of Ireland, which is unique in that it's a north-south congress across the island, were supportive of the Remain position was, whilst we recognise that Europe is not perfect as a set of political institutions, it does provide certainty and protection around things like workers' rights, and it also had been very supportive of the peace process and supportive of the move to peace across the island. So obviously what we have been focused on as a union since then in terms of Brexit is trying to protect the Good Friday Agreement and mitigate the impacts on the agreement. And I think it's fair to say the last couple of weeks has been extremely worrying and disconcerting in that we thought we had some mitigation through the protocol in that sense. And now we see through the internal market bill, as Karin is saying, you either have a situation where the protocol wasn't understood or is being deliberately misinterpreted. The cynic amongst you might think, given where we are with the COVID crisis, whether there is maybe a slightly cynical attempt to cast the eye back to Brexit at this point. We would be very worried about the elements of the internal market bill in particular, outside of the really outrageous statements that were made in Parliament about international law. The elements of the protocol in particular that affect the devolution settlement and affect the ability of our locally elected representatives at Stormont to continue to, as we would be encouraging them to do, pursue more progressive policies around things like workers' rights and equality into the future, and mirror developments at the European level, and particularly developments across the island of Ireland. There is the potential in that bill that could be unpicked and eroded. So it's a troubling time, and I think the internal market bill obviously is the main focus right now. But the overall message when we look to the future in terms of, Karin talked about what we would want devolution to be. What we as a union in Northern Ireland have always wanted devolution to be in Northern Ireland is an opportunity to develop policies within a framework of equality and human rights, to put the rights of the people first, and to deal with many of the long-standing structural problems we have in Northern Ireland around poverty, around unemployment, around poor educational outcomes, around the need to improve and reform our health service. And those bread and butter issues don't go away. They remain, and they will remain after Brexit as they existed long before. So there's many priorities there, and I think we can get ourselves very focused on constitutional issues and Brexit-related issues. There's still a real need to focus on those as well, and for other parts of the UK to appreciate that our particular circumstances are not just related to Brexit. They're actually about dealing with a lot of the long-standing problems that we have.
Thank you, John Patrick. That was fascinating, as always. Right, we'll stay on Northern Ireland and we will come to Stephen Farry MP, who is an Alliance MP from Belfast next.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Mike. Good morning, everyone. Sorry for being a few seconds late there in joining, but I've got caught up on most of the conversation. Just to pick up there from John Patrick's point, the controversy around the protocol in international law has somewhat overshadowed what in itself is a very challenging piece of legislation, which intrudes into the devolution settlement. There certainly is a need for some type of structure to the UK internal market post-Brexit, sadly post-Brexit. But what we have is much more centralised approach than we would have seen under its predecessor, the EU single market. So there are certainly tensions there. Just on the politics around this, I mean, this is really, really serious stuff for us. And the problem is there's no real good outcome here for Northern Ireland, and a lot of care and attention and sensitivity is required to try to work through the tensions. The basic problem is that, this is my probably stock phrase, probably Aodhan's heard this 1,000 times, I mean, Northern Ireland only works through sharing and interdependence, and it's important that people recognise that Northern Ireland is essentially a fault line on the map. It's both a divided society internally, but also a contested space in that there are different constitutional aspirations. And the beauty of the Good Friday Agreement, and this is where people are missing the point at times, people are taking a very rigorous textual analysis to it and not understanding the meaning behind the words, or focusing almost entirely on the issue of the principle of consent and a majoritarian approach to which territory Northern Ireland does or doesn't belong to, and everything flowing from that. At its heart, essentially, there's a grand bargain here where nationalists, for the first time, probably in probably get my maths right, 75 plus years in 1998, recognised the legitimacy of Northern Ireland, albeit with rules agreed on how you change the constitution. And in return, there was a recognition that Northern Ireland existed in an interdependent sphere, and there had to be free flow of people, both north, south, and east, west, and also business operating freely in that respect. So while people were happy or unhappy to be in Northern Ireland, the impact of that decision was being minimised, and you had that free flow. None of this would have happened, either the Good Friday Agreement itself or what flowed from it, if both the UK and Ireland hadn't simultaneously been part of the customs union and the single market. So that enabled essentially the border in Ireland to wither away and become fairly marginal in terms of people's lives. Obviously, there are a few differences here and there, but by and large, that was the gain from that. The difficulty we have is that, especially whenever people choose to go for a hard Brexit as opposed to the whole UK staying in the customs union and the single market, a line has to be drawn on a map somewhere. There will be an interface between the UK single market and customs union and its EU equivalents. And where that line goes and how that line is managed is incredibly problematic. And that has essentially bedeviled the Brexit efforts over the past 4 years, because at times the Conservative Party in particular just haven't come to terms with the implications of the choices that they've made. So the protocol isn't something that was forced on the UK by the European Union. It's better seeing the protocol as being the logical outworking of the UK's own decisions as a requirement to try to protect the particular circumstances that we find ourselves in Northern Ireland. The backstop, the much maligned backstop, would have been a far better and easier alternative than the protocol. The protocol does pose huge challenges, and no doubt Aodhan will talk those through from a business angle. But I think, given that it's been seen as a given from Theresa May's days in the UK, and critically in the European Union and obviously Ireland and the United States, that an open border in Ireland is an absolute necessity. That then poses a challenge to how you manage the Irish Sea interface. So we need to make that, the current phrase I'm using is as much of a dotted line rather than a solid line. And you have 7 crossing points to manage as opposed to 270. The number of movements is less on the Irish Sea interface than it is on the land border. But the key challenge is to work inside the protocol, inside the Joint Committee, to get as much mitigation and flexibility, rather than trying to circumvent it and breaching international law and placing Northern Ireland in a very uncertain position. So, in conclusion, the constitutional question isn't reopened directly by Brexit, in the sense that the principle of consent is hardwired into the Good Friday, into the withdrawal agreement. But it will also be naive not to say that wherever you draw that line on a map, there will be emotional and psychological implications that arise from that, and political ramifications. Equally, Northern Ireland leaving the EU poses difficulties for other people and other viewpoints within the Northern Ireland community. So what had been a largely stable issue up until 2016, and we have plenty of other problems in terms of the internal politics of Northern Ireland. Post 2016, the external environment in terms of the British-Irish relationship, the interplay between the north, south, east, west interface, were all thrown up in the air. So that is destabilising, and we are now in a much more fluid situation. I'm not expecting any constitutional change imminently, but it is something that is certainly much more up the agenda than it had been previously. And the difficulty is that the way the Boris Johnson government is acting, and this applies the same with Scotland, every action that they do is pushing both Scotland and Northern Ireland further and further away from the centre, and potentially out of the door of the UK.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Then lastly, on Northern Ireland, we'll come to Aodhan, and then we'll come to Paul, and we'll do Scotland. And then we'll have some time for questions. Thank you, Stephen. Go ahead, Aodhan.
Hi. One of the bad things about going after JP and Stephen is that they cover everything, leave me very little to say. But it's okay. I do have a few things.
You can deal the tough stuff in.
Well, you know. So I am the director of the Northern Ireland Retail Consortium. Don't hold it against me. But I also the convener of the Northern Ireland Business Brexit Working Group, a group who needs a better name. What we do is, you know, we brought everyone together from all types of business to look at what the ramifications of Brexit are, and also to try and lobby for the best for the people of Northern Ireland. A lot of people are looking at this as a macroeconomic, big trade, big numbers, whereas what I personally, and what the Northern Ireland Retail Consortium is trying to do, is look at this as microeconomic right down to households. And the reason we have is because Northern Ireland households have half of the discretionary income of Great British households. We have about £119 per week after all the big bills are paid. In GB, the average is about 215. The highest levels of indebtedness, the highest level of financial insecurity of anywhere in the UK. And quite simply, we can't afford to have cost rises, because the people who it will affect most when those frictions come in are those people who are most economically vulnerable. And for every couple of percent that the costs in the shopping basket go up, more and more people are going into food poverty in Northern Ireland. And you know what? One of the good things about the peace process is that we have had investment, we have had growth in the private sector, we have had big name supermarkets and big name shops from GB coming over, as well as other places, and what that has done is made it more competitive. It's driven down prices, and it means that actually we've had a better standard of living here. But that better standard of living isn't just because of peace. The better standard of living is because we have not built over 20 years, we've built over 40 years through our membership of the EU. And that's why we can have things like just-in-time supply chains. It amazes me, you know, I'm still like a child in the sweetie shop when I see some of the effects and figures. You can have a lorry load of peppers and tomatoes and broccoli coming from the south of Spain, and you can tell within a 2-hour window when that's going to hit a supermarket in Ballymena or Belfast or even Ballinamallard. And that to me is an amazing piece of technology, really. But it's not just about getting things from A to B. It's getting things from A to B, back to B, over to C and back. But we don't talk about an integrated supply chain on the island. We talk about integrated supply chains on these islands. So Bottle of Bailey's will have 5 border movements north and south before it's a finished product. The M&S chicken salad sandwich will have 7 movements north, south, east and west. And the humble cottage pie, which I always like to mention, will have 8 border movements north, south, east and west. So for example, the meat will be slaughtered in Northern Ireland, will go across to Doncaster for second cuts, will come across. Even the milk for the cheese topping, the milk comes from Northern Ireland, but it's processed into cheese in the Republic of Ireland and then comes back. So what Brexit is doing is it's making things a lot more difficult. We're going to see frictions that we have never seen before. And remember, friction means costs. And with retail, we have a very, very low profit margin, high volume. That means even small cost rises can have a really bad effect on the bottom line. And there's a very, very simple equation that if the new costs are higher than the profit margins, then either the product or the business model becomes unviable. And that's going to affect Northern Ireland consumers. If I move on actually to the point of the union, how would I put this? Brexit's done more to put the constitutional question to a head in Northern Ireland than the Troubles did. Because what we had done with the Good Friday Agreement, you were allowed to be British, you were allowed to be Irish, you were allowed to be Northern Irish, you were allowed to be any mixture of those. And it was settled, and we were going from a society in conflict to a post-conflict society. Now, that takes a long time. We've seen it across the world, but actually, the growth of our private sector, the growth in jobs, the growth in standard of living my son is not growing up in the same Northern Ireland that I grew up in. And I'm very, very proud to say that. In fact, one of the reasons I became involved in business and politics was I was always a great believer that if people had jobs to go to, if people had a good education, if people had a good health system, then they wouldn't be out throwing petrol bombs or shooting each other. But because Brexit has brought this constitutional issue to a head again, there is an embitterment now, and even with a new generation that we haven't seen before. And what for me, this is all very, very strange, because it's up to both sides to show that Northern Ireland works. If the Republican element or nationalist element want there to be a united Ireland, they need to show that they're not going to be a burden on the south of Ireland, and that has to work. The Unionists need to show that Northern Ireland works and sell the Union. But that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is at election time, they go into election mode and it's vote for us or you'll get them. And it's the politics of fear rather than the politics of selling your beliefs, selling your economic programme, and selling what you want to achieve for a new Northern Ireland. With Brexit as well, the constitutional issue, because of the problems we've had in Northern Ireland, this isn't going to go away. We will have a vote every 6 years. So 4 years and then 2 years of a break period, and then a vote, and then 4 years. And this is picking the scab on a constitutional wound that will happen every 6 years. And to me, the divisiveness, the complete lack of stability that the Brexit question and therefore the constitutional question has brought to Northern Ireland has been unbelievable. Usually there's a lot of what used to be old Section 30s, which is large planning applications, that's for big supermarkets or stores over a certain capacity. Before Brexit happened, there was like 83 of those that were coming through my desk for retail impact assessments. Now there's 4. And that's because people will not invest where they see that there's going to be uncertainty. And what we're entering into with the Northern Ireland Protocol is a cyclical uncertainty. So what we need is to get some way to make this work. Now, don't get me wrong, the Northern Ireland Protocol is still better than no deal. And I will always say that, and that people think it's quite strange that I'm not out there giving it a kicking. And personally, there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of things that we need solved as far and we can do that through the Joint Committee, but mostly through an FTA with the EU that will remove the differences between GB and NI. If we don't, it becomes more like a brick wall than a paper wall. I think just to finish off, I'll just, from the internal market bill, there's a lot of questions within the internal market bill. It's not a bag, it's not a dead cat, it's throwing a bag of dead cats onto the table, especially this blockade that people were talking about, GB to NI. That couldn't happen under the NI protocol. Article 16 and Annex 7 says that the UK can take unilateral action to keep us fed in the short term while things are being sorted out. So that's just not going to happen. In fact, the internal market bill doesn't deal with GB to NI anyway. But what it also does, it looks at what devolved powers that the UK central government and Westminster can start clawing back. I think as far as the constitution of the UK, as far as the strength of the union, no matter on what side you stand on, I think this is a time when there's been more peril than ever, and it hasn't been caused by violence, but it's been caused by politics.
Thank you, Aodhan. Lots of food for thought there. Right, we will have lots of time to discuss Northern Ireland in a minute, but firstly, Scotland's all on your shoulders this morning, Paul, so sorry about that. So we'll come to Paul to talk about Scotland and the implications for Scotland, obviously in the context of Scottish politics and the Holyrood election is coming up next May, and the constant drumbeat from the SNP for the second independence referendum. So thank you for joining us, Paul.
Thanks. Real pleasure to join. Some really interesting discussion. It's something that's overshadowed my entire adult political life, really. You know, my first election I voted in was 2007, when the SNP emerged as the largest party in Scotland for the first time by 1 seat, and then in 2011 became a majority in a system that was designed to produce minorities. And then obviously the Scottish independence referendum was held in 2014. Labour's 41 MPs were wiped out in 2015, down to 1. And then in 2017 I was elected as an MP, 16 to 1 in the bookies, you know, so it's been a fairly volatile decade in Scottish politics, to say the least. And Brexit, certainly in 2016, has merely added an accelerant to that fire that was already going on. And I think it's interesting to listen from a Northern Irish perspective about the tensions this has brought in. I mean, it was quite clear to me throughout the discussions, as Aodhan had mentioned, about the trilemma, as I was calling it, this possible trinity of where do you draw this line. You know, if you're going to refuse totemically to be in the single market and customs union, then you're going to have to draw a red line somewhere. It's either going to be on the frontier with the Republic, or it's going to be down the Irish Sea. And that failure to the level of ignorance, frankly, that persisted in Westminster about this was extraordinary, given the implications of it. And that was the most frustrating thing, really. The kind of the lack of any, the kind of metropolitan arrogance of it all was just the most damaging thing I felt. The inability to kind of understand the dynamics that play outside the M25, you know. And I think that's a real concern. And it's just interesting to hear that discussion played out, you know. And it not only that, but the very first thing I actually asked in the House of Commons when Theresa May gave a statement, it was before my maiden speech actually, and I said to her, Brexit isn't just about the interface between the UK and the EU, it throws everything about the UK's constitution up in the air, and there doesn't seem to be any understanding, far less discussion about that implication. And now we're seeing it play out with the internal market bill. We're seeing the whole nature of devolution, which was designed, baked in the assumptions that the EU would always be a constant. That is kind of ripped out by its roots. So it's left with this kind of this architecture that isn't designed to deal with a non-EU context. And that's where the sort of the internal market bill is just trying to retrofit very candidly onto the sort of vacuum that's been created by the EU's single market and the EU Commission's role in that to be removed. And that's where you've got this whole thing about a power grab, you know, has been accused, you know, this idea that, you know, by Westminster being able to set standards and define the sort of overarching nature of how this single market should work within the UK, the internal market within the UK should work, it's effectively imposing power relationships onto the devolved administrations, which are unacceptable and aren't appropriate in the context of the devolved acts, particularly the Scotland Acts. So that's where you have this tension emerging. And whilst we have we need to have some sort of internal market arrangements, you know, obviously having common food standards is essential, you know, and various other things that make logical sense. There's not any clear consensual process which has been followed by the Conservative government to deal with those issues. What they're effectively doing is writing by diktat what they're going to do, and expecting the devolved governments to simply eat it up. And I think that's the real tension that's been introduced. So it's kind of like just further antagonisation of what's already a problematic situation, particularly in Scotland. And like you see, we've now seen the opinion polling this year switch to a majority for a separate state. You know, on the binary yes/no question. What's quite interesting is that when you should dig into it in a bit more detail about would you like a hard border with England, the majority swiftly evaporates. You know, so it's actually when you drill into the binary yes/no question, which was presented in 2014, it's a bit more complicated than that. It's not quite as inevitable as people would like to spin it as, but nonetheless, Labour has got a real challenge on its hands, and it can't simply have the ostrich approach, which it seems to be content to do at the moment, which is to say we don't want any more constitutional tinkering. There isn't a demand for independence in Scotland. It's kind of like watching that. Remember the Iraqi information minister during the Iraq war, and it's kind of like denying the reality of what's going on. You know, it's not satisfactory anymore. You know, I paid a very high personal price in December for the fact that we're not willing to confront this issue realistically. You know, and what we need to do, I'm not saying it in an antagonistic way. What I'm saying is we need to be imaginative and bold about it, because it's a huge opportunity. It's big politics. It's sort of big politics that Labour were ahead of in the 1990s, talking about devolution, talking about a new constitutional settlement, talking about modernisation, and delivering progress. And it felt tangible. It felt like a progressive thing for people to get behind. And that's why Labour was so successful in those years, because it was actually presenting something that was constructive and visionary and consensual. And at the moment, we've just been lost in this binary extreme between English nationalism and Scottish nationalism. You know, you've got a kind of conservative government that's acting as an English nationalist party in many respects. You know, it isn't even a unionist party anymore, and really, it's fair to say. And you've got obviously the Scottish nationalists in the other extreme, which are pitching for, you know, a situation which they don't seem to fully grasp. You know, the thing that I always go back to them on is, you're talking about a separate state, but, you know, you want to rejoin the European Union, but you want to maintain sterling. You know, by definition, you can't rejoin the European Union as a separate state without a central bank and separate currency. You know, so their own position is conflicted and fundamentally irreconcilable. But that's not really being interrogated at the moment. The whole debate in Scotland is defined by revulsion at Boris Johnson, you know, absolute frustration at another Conservative government, which, you know, has very low support in Scotland, and also Brexit, which obviously was not supported by the Scottish people, by a majority. So that's a tension where people are just reacting against that reality and saying, well, let's just get out of the whole situation, but they're not actually confronting what that means as well. So they're kind of stuck. The debate in Scotland is really stuck in a very bitter place right now, a very frustrating place. That's where the opportunity presented for Labour to come forward with something constructive. And I think that's what we really need to look at. You know, we talked about federation, federalism. You know, simply using that word's not going to cut it anymore. You know, when I say those words in Scotland now, it's just an eye roll they get. You know, oh, you've been banging on about this for years, and what does it even mean? You know, you're going to actually tell us what this, you know, means. Is it a Canadian system? Is it an Australian system? Is it a German system? What is it you're talking about? And I don't think Labour's really put the intellectual bandwidth into actually defining what it is. You know, at least the SNP have got a growth commission, and they've had a white paper on exactly what the nuts and bolts of their proposed solution is, however flawed it might be and however much we can rip it apart. But we haven't ever presented an alternative, you know, other than effectively this kind of shambolic status quo, which is increasingly untenable. So unless we're able to actually drive through it with something constructive, which is actually building a symmetrical architecture for the UK's constitution, you know, my solution would probably be something along the lines of a German-style federation where, you know, the English regions effectively have their own parliaments, equivalent in power to Holyrood. You level up all the powers across the UK, equivalent to Holyrood. You know, for example, the London mayoralty becomes the first mayor of London in a London parliament. I think that would be my preferred solution. But not only that, we need to confront the reality of electoral reform. One of the big tensions that's introduced in this country is the huge disparities geographically caused by the first past the post electoral system, where the SNP can win 45% of the popular vote in Scotland, yet emerge with 90% of the seats. You know, that isn't effective, and it's introducing a huge tension in the UK. So we have to confront that reality as well, that you know, what could become a federal parliament in Westminster is introduced huge distortions geographically. We need to confront that. We need to look at something like single transferable vote with larger constituencies. These are things we need to seriously consider. And I think that's definitely a massive issue. You know, as we approach the 2021 elections, it's highly likely there'll be a pro-independence majority. They'll ask for the right to hold another referendum. I think the Conservatives will refuse it. But what's Labour's response to that? You know, we are in opposition, obviously, so we're not as het as we might have been maybe even a year ago when the prospect of a Labour government was more realistic. But as we approach 2024, this is going to actually be a fundamental part of the dynamics of that election. And if we're hoping to have, you know, a recovery of at least 16 seats in Scotland that we need to form a government, then we're going to have to seriously have something to say about it. And it's not going to be any good to say now is not the time. Obviously, only a quarter of people in Scotland think it's a priority right now, independence, but it's still something that people are feeling strongly about. We need to say we have to rebuild the country after the coronavirus, but we also need to have something constructive to look forward to. And I think this time in opposition for the next 3 or 4 years, we need to really seriously have something to offer in 2024, which is a, you know, shovel ready, if you like, or oven ready. Maybe I should use that word. Oven ready constitutional concept to take forward to people. You know, this is a draft constitution for the UK. If Labour comes into power, we'll implement it as a matter of urgency because we recognise the existential threat that Brexit presents to Britain as a policy. And I think that concerns Northern Ireland as well. You know, the huge concerns over what they're proposing where they're going to draw this red line. I think Labour needs to confront the reality. We need a closer relationship with the EU in terms of the single market and customs union. If we're going to melt away that hard border, wherever it's going to exist, it can't be sustainable. And I think Labour needs to have a serious challenge to that. It was always Labour's position with the 6 tests we had to maintain alignment and to maintain as porous a border as we could. And I think that's got to continue to be our position. We have to be clear about the integrity of the UK as our overarching priority, but that also means we cannot compromise on the Good Friday Agreement. So the only solution and the trilemma is to maintain alignment with the single market and customs union. You know, the deduction's obvious once you go through that. So the same challenge presented with Scotland. Scottish independence effectively means a hard border in the island of Great Britain as well as the island of Ireland. You know, so it's not going to, the fragmentation's not satisfactory in any sense. But that presents an opportunity for Labour to come through and say these extremes are going to tear us all apart. They're going to introduce huge costs, economic decline, lower living standards. In Scotland's case, it wipes out 25% of GDP. It wipes out the equivalent of the NHS and public spending in Scotland. It's not a good outcome. But we have to have something, we can't just simply rail against it. We have to have something more compelling to offer. And it has to be one built on the respect for sovereignty, sharing sovereignty, vesting it in parliaments. It's not simply that the Parliament of Westminster is a monopoly on sovereignty, which seems to be the Tory position. It has to be that the relationship between the devolved parliaments and the federal or the new parliament, the central parliament in Westminster, has to be one built on consensus, that they legislate by agreement, they legislate cooperatively, and that's how we can get through this challenge. At the moment, it's simply government by edict by a very arrogant Conservative majority in Westminster, who are obviously, you know, hubristic about their results in December, but are actually riding roughshod over the very fabric of the UK, and risk, by gripping it so tightly, risk fracturing it. You know, so our solution needs to be flex, not fracture. You know, that's really where we need to be at. The frustration for me has just been the lack of bandwidth that we've devoted to this. You know, I know John Trickett was leading on it in the last, you know, Labour leadership, but nothing was ever produced. It was a real source of frustration for me as on the front bench as a shadow Scottish minister, you know, that we were not saying anything constructive. We kept going back to federalism. It wasn't sufficient. It was met with contempt by the population in Scotland. So we need to do better. And I'm sort of issuing this sort of challenge to the Labour Party, really, to say we need to get a grip of this. It's not good enough just to sort of, you know, say we'll deal with it at some indeterminate point in the future, because it's coming up fast. And if we don't have something constructive to say by 2024, we're going to be in a bad place to recover and even have a hope of forming a majority. So that's my raising the stakes. I feel like, you know, there's a real sense of urgency here.
Great, thank you, Paul. Karin, that was great, fascinating. Lots to come back on that. Karin, I know you've got to go, but just one question that was posed just to you. What are your thoughts on the Northern Ireland Protocol, and do you think the EU has a right to enforce checks between Northern Ireland and Great Britain?
I saw that. I don't know if our anonymous attendee is Mr. Boris Johnson or not, but I'd say you know,
Very likely, yeah.
It's being put. I wouldn't like us to be in this place, but the protocol is a compromise agreed last minute on the Wirral between the Taoiseach and Prime Minister Johnson, and sold to us, and so we have to make it make it work, and those are the things that the Prime Minister has agreed. You know, very much so, and we've said this in Parliament again last week. The rhetoric needs to be dialed down. Both sides need to get back to the negotiating table. There are plenty of provisions in the protocol to resolve disagreements, and that's absolutely where we need to get back to, and dial down the rhetoric, dial down the tension. I think panelists here, I mean, particularly John Pratt and Aodhan, have highlighted the poverty, particularly in Northern Ireland, the lack of access to some of the things, you know, that potentially we in Britain and in Ireland expect as rights, needs to be front and centre. Those bread and butter issues, waiting lists in Northern Ireland are shocking, would not be tolerated here in England, and they're pretty bad. And so that's what we need to be focusing on, and resolve the tensions, the disagreements within the provisions that are already there. There are no shortages of committees for people in Northern Ireland and the European Union to be on in the next few years, or specialised committees, joint working consultative committees, as well as the joint committee. There are a load of provisions in the strands of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement to also ensure greater prosperity across all these islands. So that's what Mr. Johnson agreed. That's what he needs to stick to. And thank you for your time this morning. So I do need to get a train.
No problem. Great to see you, Karin. Thank you so much.
And also on the Constitutional Convention, I'd agree. Let's get on and talk about these things. I don't think we can postpone them for long. We might all disagree, but as I said, it's an opportunity. We've had this in our manifesto since before 2015, and we should be considering these issues much more carefully. Thank you.
I agree. Great stuff. Thanks so much. See you soon. Bye-bye. Right. So I just want to ask a couple of questions myself, based on what you guys have all said. And then we'll come to questions from the attendees. So attendees, if you have questions, please pop them in the Q&A and we'll get through as many as we can before 9:45. But just a couple of things from me. So I think a number of you have talked about the principle of consent. This is about Northern Ireland and just how that was fundamental to the Good Friday Agreement, and that's fundamental about the future status of Northern Ireland and its presence between the Republic of Ireland and the UK. Obviously, the principle of consent has been challenged by Brexit, but one of the ways that it's been most fundamentally challenged is that Northern Ireland has been taken out of the European Union against its will. It did not vote for Brexit, but Brexit is being enforced upon it. Has that made a reunified Ireland more likely? Does that make another outcome more likely? How do people feel about that? I mean, obviously, Northern Ireland is now left between, it's still in the customs union and single market, and it has to be, but it's also in the UK internal market. So that's one question. But my next question that follows from that is, given its unique status, I think it's the only territory in the world that's going to be in two customs systems. Is this a sustainable outcome for Northern Ireland? Or is it inevitably temporary? If it is inevitably temporary, what comes next? That's a big question, but whichever of you wants to take that on. Aodhan, would you like to have first stab?
I suppose on the I said at the start of my remarks that that Brexit had done more to bring the constitutional question to a head than the Troubles ever did, because it was saying very, very blanket one way or the other. My grandfather, God rest him, had quite nationalist, quite almost Republican tendencies, and he always said that the biggest thing stopping a united Ireland was not unionists; it was middle-class nationalists who would not vote for united Ireland if they thought that it would harm their pocket. And what you've got with Brexit, if the sterling tanks, if Northern Ireland loses investment, is that it will hurt a lot of people's pockets, and the idea of a united Ireland then becomes more amenable to them. I think, though, what we have for in business terms, we have to look at this in a pragmatic way. What Brexit has proven again is constitutional change is very bad for business. It provides uncertainty. It stops investment. People will not invest where they see that there is uncertainty. Even those people who are trying to sell the internal market bill and saying, "Well, look, it sorts everything out." NI to GB. One of the things about that is that it's judiciable, and people will not invest under a regime that can be challenged in the courts. I think. For me, and I have to look at this as a business head rather than with my heart. And for me, the biggest challenge that we have here in Northern Ireland is continuing to see that growth in public sector, or in private sector, sorry. We've been far too reliant on the public sector and the beg and boom mentality from Westminster. I think the way that the constitutional issue has not only presented itself at the moment, but will continue to present itself every 6 years, does not give that stability to allow for long-term investment. Even if you look at infrastructure, those big infrastructure projects, they don't actually start making profit until about 12, 15 years in, and they're usually 30-year projects. So how are we going to get that PFI? How are we going to get that growth and sustainability in Northern Ireland while this constitutional question remains unanswered? And that would be my big concern.
Great, thank you. John Patrick, anything to add?
Yeah, I think your question's about the principle of consent being challenged is a tricky one, in that Stephen referred to in his remarks about how you can look at the Good Friday Agreement in a very legalistic way if you wish. And of course, the curiosity of the Good Friday Agreement is it was never really fully legislated for. There are provisions within the Good Friday Agreement that were never actually brought into law, and that's how we've ended up with situations like Emma DeSouza's case, for example, and the tricky issues we've had around citizenship over the last couple of years. The principle of consent, I think it's, whilst legally the principle of consent has been found to be relating purely to that question about the future constitutional status of Northern Ireland, politically it has added a bit of fuel to the fire for the reason you've just said. People in Northern Ireland didn't vote for Brexit, and now there's the potential that it will breed resentment. And as Aodhan remarked, it potentially breeds resentment in the young, who feel that something's happening that they have no say in. I think to your wider point about the future for Northern Ireland, the sustainability for Northern Ireland, I suppose that if you take an historic view on it, that is the nature of this island as a whole. We have been in a constant state of political flux for 200 years, 250 years, and those issues, the constitutional question will always be in the air. What Brexit does is maybe change the temperature on the debate. The economic situation, as Aodhan says, still is the great unresolved issue within Northern Ireland. And whilst you would have maybe disagreement about the best way to improve Northern Ireland economically and improve its fortunes economically, I think a worrying thing that I've heard some in the business community point to is that if you compare Northern Ireland's economic growth with the economic growth this was pre-coronavirus, so obviously coronavirus will have an impact on this, with economic growth that was predicted in the Republic, the Republic will outstrip Northern Ireland over and over and over and over again. So those disparities will sharpen, those inequalities will sharpen. And I think that's always been the concern amongst the trade union movement as a whole, is this idea that the weaknesses we already have in our economic situation maybe get exacerbated more and more by Brexit. And people's lives just get worse and continually worse over a period of time. And I think that we can talk about the constitutional issues in a very, very broad sense, in a political sense, but at the end of the day, you still have 1.8 million people who are living lives in whatever they choose to call Northern Ireland, the North, the 6 counties, whatever. And their lives are not getting better, and in some circumstances are getting worse. And I think when we talk about Northern Ireland and the peace process and the outworkings of the peace process, I think there needs to be much more focus on that. Regardless of whatever happens with the constitutional future, it'll be for the people to determine that at whatever point that happens. There still has to be that aspiration, just fundamentally, to make people's lives better, to deliver on their rights. And I think sometimes when we talk about the constitutional issues in the broad sense, that gets lost in that discussion. So I think going back to a focus on how do we improve our education system, our health system, because it's the right thing to do in of itself, regardless of whether it in any way changes the constitutional weather. I think we need to move back to that sort of focus going forward.
Great, thank you. And then thanks, John Patrick. Stephen, anything to add?
Yeah, not a huge amount to add. Just for the record, to make clear, as the Alliance Party, we don't take a formal position on either the Union or United Ireland. We're cross-community in that sense, but one day we may be in a situation where we need to take a view on that if it's a referendum. Our focus has always been around trying to make Northern Ireland work and to promote reconciliation, build integration. And I suppose one reflection would be, as well, I fully respect the rules that have been set out, and those are the rules and won't be changed. I think intellectually that there may well be a need to try to think through how we move away from what is a very stark majoritarian choice either way, whether it's the Union or Northern Ireland be part of a United Ireland or a shared Ireland. and whether we can conceptualize something else in between, which is much more consistent with the notion of trying to bring people together and to find some sort of constitutional way forward that reflects that mix of opinions. That's a very difficult task, and one that may well be doomed to ultimately to failure. But I think those are conversations and questions I think we do need to raise and to explore. At the moment, this is largely a theoretical discussion we've had in Northern Ireland, and even with that, a lot of people have moved their opinion. We simply at this stage don't know exactly what will happen on the 1st of January and what the political as well as economic ramifications are going to be from that, whether that puts the brakes on or whether that accelerates some of those conversations, and it could go either way. For now, my instinct is that actually Scotland's probably on a slightly quicker trajectory than Northern Ireland, just to tee up Paul there. But that situation could obviously change next year depending on how the protocol works out, or indeed if there's no protocol and no future relationship.
Thank you, Stephen. Right, quick question for you, Paul, and then we've got a couple of questions from the audience, and then we need to finish up. Just thinking about independence referendum. I mean, it feels like there almost certainly will be a referendum at some point, whether Johnson allows it over the next 4 years or whether it comes, after the 2024 election. It feels like there's a push for that referendum to happen, and if it does, then for those of us who do believe in the union with Scotland, we're going to need to win it. Some people I've been talking to recently about that say that the best way to do that, or a potential way to do that, is to make sure that it's a referendum on independence, not versus the status quo, but independence versus a new settlement between England and Scotland. Is that your view? And if so, have you put much thought into what that new settlement could be? And also, do you think that would work, or do you think that those who want independence are just going to win anyway?
I mean, I've been pro-federation since I was about 14. I'm a bit precocious, you might add, a bit of a political nerd, but I studied different constitutions when I was doing modern studies in school, and it just became obvious to me, why doesn't England have its own parliament, for example, or why doesn't England deal with it? I feel that England's the last colony of the British Empire in many ways. That it's kind of not actually got its own democratic polity. It's basically the biggest problem with Westminster is it's hijacked by English domestic politics. It's not a federal parliament in the true sense. That's why it sometimes finds it very difficult to deal with the other nations of the UK constructively, because it almost acts as a sort of proxy domestic parliament for England, and that's a real challenge. My view would be, personally, whether this is realistic or not is another matter, but England basically needs to become a bit like Prussia. It needs to fragment politically into different states that then is more balanced, so there's a more balanced population across the UK. England represents over 80% of the British population. It's quite difficult to sort of have a balanced federation when you've got California lumped in with Rhode Island, so it's quite difficult, to construct this. That's a conversation for England to have, of course, about what the nature of its federal arrangements would be. But this is a conversation we need to have now. The challenge I often get in Scotland when people say, "Oh, but Scotland can't vote for a federation if England doesn't want it." So that's usually the sort of the rebuttal from the nationalist side. You can't, Scotland can't drag the UK into a federation unilaterally by voting for it in some referendum. So really, it's not so much a Scottish problem; it's a rest of UK problem, particularly an English problem. Unless England's willing to confront its own constitutional, reform needs, it's kind of like not able to have a dialogue with the rest of the UK constructively. I think that's a big problem, So that's the biggest challenge to actually presenting a reform option in Scotland. Devo Max and federations greeted with derision. You promised all this in 2014. Did it ever happen? The problem is Labour's not been in government since 2010, so it's not been able to affect anything, really. You had interventions by Gordon Brown at the latter stages of the 2014 referendum, and there was all these kind of promises made, but it was almost kind of Gordon projecting his own kind of idealistic state onto this situation. It wasn't necessarily something that David Cameron was going to deliver. What did we get at this end of the referendum? English votes for English laws. You know, he came out of down Downing Street and basically said, right, you've had your say, Scott, it's now time for England to address, you know, English votes for English laws. And it was kind of like a way to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Do you know what I mean? It just was a massive gift to the nationalist grievance machine. You know, so it wasn't you know, truth and reconciliation or anything like that. You know, it wasn't about, recognise that 45% of Scots don't want to be part of this country. That's a big problem. You know, it's not just victory. You know, that's not good. You know, how do we address their concerns, you know, meaningfully and with a bit of humility? You know, that wasn't the attitude at all in 2014, and that's how basically 2015 turned into a massive backlash against Labour. You know, it was seen as, why were you in bed with the Tories facilitating this kind of triumphalism? That's why we get smashed in 2015, and there's still a massive amount of distrust amongst our working class voters, you know, who by majority voted for independence. You know, Glasgow voted 60%, well, sorry, 55% for independence. You know, so big challenge there. You know, and I think that schism still there. It's not as severe as it was 5 years ago, but it's still permeating under the surface. You know, it still colours. It's the prism through which everything in Scotland is viewed from. You know, even things like drug deaths in Scotland are viewed through the prism of Westminster refuses to reform, gives us the powers to reform. You know, even these things are all viewed through their constitutional lens. So it's a real tension between, you know, self-determination and, you know, the utility of independence and what the alternatives are. I think we do need to move to a federation. I know that's the preferred end state, but how do you arrive at it, particularly when Labour is not seriously addressing the issue? You know, that's our challenge to deal with. And I think we can certainly get ahead of the challenge if we were imaginative enough and bold enough. I've often considered things like a multi-option referendum. That just gets quite messy, you know, as well. Like, how do you have a menu of options? How do you define who wins it then? You know, you know, it's difficult. It's not easy. Although I think that these kind of complex questions are ill-served by binary options as well, as we've seen with Brexit. You know, it's just opened up a bloody Pandora's box. You know, when was the single market and customs duties on the ballot paper? You know, none of the factors were considered. And that's the problem. Like, I think if Brexit was interrogated in the way it should have been with regards to what happens with Northern Ireland when we leave the customs union single market, it wouldn't have won a majority, I don't think. Same issue in Scotland. You know, I mean, you actually look at if you just replay 2014, yes versus no, it's a very much an identity thing, and yes is now kind of in a majority. But actually, when you present the question about, do you want a hard border with England, would you have your own currency? Would you rejoin the EU because that's what it would need? The majority melts away. You know, so the referendums are the effective form of democracy. They're not actually dealing with the issue. They're fairly novel. I think there's only been a handful of referendums in British history. You know, they aren't particularly useful ways of gauging public opinion, in my view. They actually just force trench warfare and they inflame binary divisions in society. You know, and it's probably something Northern Ireland could do without. You know, really, given the history there. You know, if it was forced to that position of a border poll. So, not an ideal situation altogether. So, there will be a request probably if the SNP form a majority, but we need to have something constructive to say. My view is invite the SNP to negotiate the terms of what an independent state might look like, nail down the detail, so it doesn't become some sort of fantastical utopian option where everyone can just project their idealistic, Cold Water Cuba or the Celtic Tiger, whatever you might want it to look like. You know, they're mutually exclusive options. It builds that coalition of support, you know, for the yes side. So we need to really drill into the detail of it, but also have something else to offer. It's not just status quo. Obviously, we do need to have something constructive, which is see all the reasons you vote yes. If you get into working class communities in the north of Glasgow, they're saying to me, "Well, I've nothing to lose. You know, why should I vote for the status quo? You know, it's been shafting me for 30 years. You know, I've lost, all the industry's gone, skilled employment's gone, we're on benefits here. You know, look at the drug problems, etc." You know, they're like, well, what have we got to lose? Might as well smash the glass and trigger the fire alarm. You know what I mean? Or hit the big red button. Everybody's, all the suits are telling you not to hit. You know, so there's almost that daring you to sort of be subversive. We need to get in there and say, see all the reasons you're voting yes. we totally get the frustration you have. But we think this is a better solution to the problem. It's not just about, no, you shouldn't do that. It's not negative. It's about, this is a more positive way forward. It's building in cooperation and collaboration, but it's respecting your rights to have your say and your own sovereignty, which is shared explicitly in a constitution. I think that's where we need to be going to. Confederal or federal, whatever permutation that might be, whatever bracket it might fall within. We need to really get in that space, because that's where nationalist impulses are much more powerful, because the pro-UK side just seems tenured to their concerns, and that's really what we need to get involved with. You could argue in Irish history, if it had happened 100 years ago, maybe we wouldn't have had this problem altogether. If there'd been proper home rule in Ireland in the early part of the 20th century, maybe it wouldn't have happened. I'm maybe speculating there, but it's the same tension boiling up in Scotland that you can see happened in Ireland maybe 100 years ago. So didn't end well, did it? So we need to really address it, or we're going to end up with the same fracture.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Right, we're a little bit over time, so I'll just come to the questions in the Q&A. We've got a couple left, and then we'll finish up. So first question is, do we have any idea what the position of the USA is to Northern Ireland and Brexit? Stephen, do you want to take that one?
I suppose it depends on who you ask in the USA, but the majority opinion would be very concerned around the implications for the Good Friday Agreement. The US role in the Good Friday Agreement is slightly overstated in the United States, but they did share the talks and play a very constructive role. They take it extremely seriously. They see it as being one of their key foreign policy successes of the past 30 years. Irish America is particularly protective of that. And while I do support a US free trade deal and appreciate there are concerns around that, which we do need to take into account, the reality is that it will be blocked if the UK government breaches the Good Friday Agreement. People forget that it's not a question of whether Trump's in office or not, it is the issue of Congress ratifying it. And Speaker Pelosi has been crystal clear on that one, but this cuts across party lines as well. So this to me, this is actually a huge dead end, and it begs the question why Boris Johnson is going down this route, because he's likely to be blocked on a future relationship with the EU until he changes courses, and the same in terms of a US deal. So I'm not quite sure how, from an economic point of view, this is sustainable or productive or rational. But that ship sailed a long time ago.
I think you're right there. Great, thank you, Stephen. And then question I'll come to you, Paul, on this one. Should Labour support any deal with the EU the Tories come back with, or should we push for a pause if the deal isn't good enough?
This is something I've reflected on for a while now, because obviously I was thinking back in the last Parliament and all the brinkmanship that happened. And the outcome for us is basically a hard Brexit, which has been a disaster. I know that we were working in the last Parliament on, confirmatory referendum and other ways in trying to engineer a soft Brexit, if you like. And I know that hindsight 2020, but I was often thinking back on if Labour had approached the outcome of the 2017 election with a less of a sort of one more heave, let's just oppose everything the Tories are doing and actually say, and if the Tories had been more constructive about coming together and sort of saying, let's have a national convention on what this Brexit should look like, bring all the parties together, be non-sectarian about it, non-factional about it, that it might have been a bit more constructive, but you had that tension with the DUP sort of holding this extreme unionist position, and you had the kind of backbench ERG group and the Tories kind of holding the Prime Minister's feet to the fire on a lot of these issues, so she was boxed in that sense. So she wasn't necessarily able to reach out across the chamber to build consensus around a kind of soft Brexit deal that would be much closer to the test Labour outlined on close alignment to the single market and customs union that could have solved this problem. So it was just a kind of perfect storm that drove us towards this outcome. And obviously the deadlock in Parliament bred this great frustration in the country that erupted in this kind of outcome that we've seen in the general election in December, where they've got this kind of red wall that's collapsed, and obviously people have, it's been a culture war with people who wouldn't normally vote Conservative for economic reasons, have voted for identity reasons or for nationalistic reasons. So So we've ended up in this situation where the Tories have got this 80 majority and they can just ride into a hard Brexit. So I don't think we should necessarily entertain whatever extreme deal they come back with. I think we need to be trying to push towards the outcomes we think are best for the integrity of the UK, but we need to frame it appropriately, which is, you know, the Tories are going to, you know, are going to potentially splinter the UK apart. It's kind of what John Smith said back in the early 1990s. He was like, there's two forces sawing away at the legs that support the union. The one side is obviously the nationalists who want to destroy the unity of the UK. The other side, you have this Conservative Party, for their own narcissism, their own arrogance, are kind of busy heaping the pressure on the union itself as well. And we kind of need to be presenting ourselves as honest brokers, saying there must be a much more sensible way of dealing with this. And the reality is, the challenges we face in the 21st century are much more, you know, require the kind of reduction in national barriers, increasing international cooperation. You know, the notions of any sort of national sovereignty of the 19th and 20th centuries are kind of melting away. You know, it's a kind of strike against the trajectory of history. You know, so we need to be much more visionary about our future. And I think that's maybe the principal position we should adopt. You know, whilst we have to accept the reality that Brexit's happened, it happened in March. You know, it's about building a future of cooperation with Europe that's much more constructive than the kind of antagonism that seems to be the Tory agenda. And, you know, like Keir was saying, you know, they're opening up all these old wounds because it's a way for them to deflect against the coronavirus and other problems. You know, if they just whip up these people into a frenzy again, this nationalistic frenzy, they're able to sort of distort the reality of how incompetent their government's been.
I agree. Great. Thank you all. Right, we're a little bit over time, so apologies to both panelists and attendees for that, but it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you all for joining us. If you want to watch this back, we will get it online within the next few days. So check out on YouTube, and that'll be under Labour for a European Future. And we've got a Brexit and its impact on people with disabilities and long-term conditions with disability Labour event at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. So if you're interested in Brexit, then tune into that. And thank you again, everybody, for your time this morning. We'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.